Edith Cran had sewn in the upper workroom at Vrath Hall for 34 years, and in that time she had learned one rule above all others: do not draw the eye of the man who owns the house. She had learned it the way the rest of the staff learned it, through proximity, through watching others forget it, through the way a room changed when Callum Vrath entered it. The conversations that stopped at the first sound of his step in the corridor. The shoulders that squared and the faces that cleared and the hands that stilled over whatever they were doing. He was not cruel. That was the thing people on the outside did not understand. He did not shout, did not threaten, did not make a spectacle of anyone's failures. He simply looked, still and level and without much warmth, and it was enough. Enough to make a grown man reconsider the words he had been about to say. Enough to make 30 years of service feel temporary. Edith had seen 4 housekeepers come and go. She had seen a head gardener resign rather than face a second conversation about the north lawn. She had seen Desmond Prohl, the family's solicitor of 30 years, move through the main corridor with his leather case and his polished shoes and his expression of courteous certainty, and she had thought, as she always did, that Prohl was the only man in the house who seemed entirely unbothered by Callum Vrath. She had attributed this, over the years, to confidence. To tenure. To the quiet authority of a man who held the legal architecture of everything the Vrath family owned. She had been wrong about that. But she would not know it for another 3 weeks. The records clerk arrived on a Tuesday in January, in a coat too thin for the northern coast and carrying a canvas bag that looked older than some of the documents she had come to sort. Her name was Nora Keel, and she had been engaged on a temporary basis, 6 weeks, perhaps 8, depending on the state of the archive, to reorganize the estate's document holdings, which had not been properly catalogued since the late Mr. Vrath's passing 2 decades prior. Edith noticed her because the workroom sat directly above the archive wing, and Edith was a woman who noticed things. She saw Nora Keel arrive and receive no particular welcome from the staff and ask no particular welcome of them. She saw her carry her canvas bag through the side door and down the stone steps to the archive without being shown the way, which meant she had read the floor plan that must have been sent with her letter of engagement. Edith found this interesting. She stored it away in the part of her mind she reserved for things that might matter later. Callum Vrath did not acknowledge Nora Keel's arrival. This was not unkindness. It was simply the way of things at Vrath Hall. Temporary staff were engaged through the house manager, briefed by the house manager, and returned to the world by the house manager when their term was done. If they did their work quietly and well, the men who owned the house might never learn their names. Nora Keel did her work quietly and well. Edith could hear it from above, the measured movement of boxes, the careful closing of cabinet drawers, the soft but deliberate rhythm of someone who knew what she was doing and was doing it without hurry. In the evenings, when the archive fell silent, she would hear the muffled sound of a chair being moved back and the faint closing of a latch, and she would know the records clerk had finished for the day. Desmond Prohl came on Thursday of the second week, as he always came, unannounced, or nearly so, his car appearing in the front drive with the quiet certainty of a thing expected. He spent 40 minutes with Callum in the study, then walked the main corridor toward the east wing, then paused outside the archive steps. Edith, who was at that moment descending from the workroom to collect a spool of thread from the linen cupboard, saw him pause. She saw him look down the steps. She saw his expression, which was nothing she could have named precisely, not alarm, not recognition, not quite either, and then he turned and walked back the way he had come. She thought nothing of it. She collected her thread and went back upstairs. It was on a Friday morning, in the 3rd week of January, that Nora Keel found the letter. She had been working through a run of archival boxes that had been stacked at the rear of the secondary cabinet, boxes that bore the estate's green storage labels but also a separate printed slip, faded with age, which read, "Destroyed, contents verified and removed," and carried a date in neat numerals, 2004. And a line of initials below that, in a hand she had come to recognize from 30 years of correspondence in the main files, DP. 4 of the 5 boxes in the run were, in fact, empty. Or nearly. They held loose packing papers, a few blank forms, the residue of a filing system that had been cleared out. The 5th box was not empty. It held, at the very bottom beneath a layer of blank vellum sheets that had been laid over it like a covering, a sealed envelope. The paper was heavy and cream-colored. The seal had never been broken. Written on the front, in a hand Nora had never seen before but which she recognized as markedly different from the neat administrative script that filled the rest of the archive, were the words, "Codicil to the will of Aldous Vrath. For the attention of his son, She set it on the sorting table and looked at it for a long time. She understood what she was looking at. She was a records clerk. She had worked in 2 solicitors' offices and 1 county probate archive before this engagement, and she understood legal documents the way a carpenter understands the grain of wood, not from study alone but from long handling. This was a codicil. It was sealed and intact. It bore a date. And it had been sitting inside a box marked destroyed, contents verified, with DP's initials below, for 20 years. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it for the length of time it took her to sharpen the pencil she had been using to mark catalog entries, which was not long. Then she picked up the envelope, placed it inside the canvas bag she had carried with her since Tuesday of the first week, went up the stone steps, and asked the house manager where Mr. Vrath could be found at this hour. He was in the sea-facing reading room. He always was, on Friday mornings. Edith knew this. Everyone who had been at Vrath Hall longer than a month knew this. The reading room had been his father's favorite room, and Callum Vrath used it on Friday mornings with a consistency that amounted, in Edith's understanding, to an act of keeping faith with the dead. She did not know how Nora Keel came to know this, since the records clerk had been at Vrath Hall for less than a month. Perhaps the house manager had told her. Perhaps she had simply asked. What Edith knew was this: she was in the upper corridor at 20 minutes past 10, carrying a length of folded linen to the cedar press, when she saw Nora Keel walk the length of the main hall below her and knock at the reading room door. She saw the door open. She saw Nora step inside. She did not go to the cedar press. She stood at the corridor window, which looked out over the same gray sea that the reading room faced from below, and she waited. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. At 35 minutes, the reading room door opened again. Nora Keel came out. She did not look distressed. She did not look triumphant. She looked, as she always looked, composed and slightly intent, as if she were still thinking through the next entry in a catalogue. She walked back the way she had come, down the main hall and through the side door toward the archive steps. At 40 minutes, the house manager was summoned to the reading room. At noon, a car arrived that Edith did not recognize, a dark car, different from Prohl's, carrying a man with a briefcase who was not Prohl. Edith went back to her workroom and sat down and could not, for the first time in years, account for where the afternoon had gone. She learned what she needed over the following days, piece by careful piece, the way information moves through a household that is too discreet to gossip openly but too human to keep entirely silent. The sealed envelope had contained a codicil to the will of Aldous Vrath, signed and witnessed in the final month of his life. The codicil established a trust, not large by the measure of the estate's holdings, but significant by every other measure, directed to the families of long-serving household staff, to be administered for the education of their children and the support of those in their number who had aged out of service. The families were named. Edith's own mother was among them. Edith, reading this when the document's general contents became known, had to sit down on the edge of her cutting table and press her hands flat against the fabric in front of her until her breathing steadied. The trust had never been established. The codicil, it emerged, had been received by Desmond Prohl in the month following Aldous Vrath's death, on behalf of the estate, and had been, by all appearances, misfiled in a storage box and marked as destroyed. Whether this had been error or intention was a matter the independent solicitor and the appropriate professional oversight body would spend some weeks determining. What was not in question was the outcome. Desmond Prohl, who had administered the Vrath estate's legal affairs for 3 decades, was quietly retired. His tenure and its fee arrangements were the subject of a review that Callum Vrath did not discuss publicly. The trust was reinstated and funded. The families were contacted. Edith Cran, who had bent her head over her work for 34 years and asked nothing, received a letter that she kept in the drawer of her sewing table for the rest of her life. What she remembered most, in the years that followed, was not the letter. What she remembered was the morning Callum Vrath walked down the stone steps to the archive. This was something she heard from the house manager's assistant, who had happened to be passing. In 34 years, Callum Vrath had not been in the archive wing. Not since his father's death had left it a room full of the old man's handwriting and the careful record of a life that was over. He went down on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the codicil had been found, and he sat at the sorting table across from Nora Keel, who had come in as she always did and was working through a box of correspondence dated to the late 1980s. He sat down. He looked at the room, at the cabinets, the labeled boxes, the careful order that had been brought to something that had been, before her, entirely without order. And then he looked at her. He asked her name. Not her position. Not how long she had been engaged. Not whether the reorganization was proceeding on schedule. Her name. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, the way a man is quiet when he has been carrying something a long time and has just, without expecting it, set it down. He thanked her. She said, and the house manager's assistant had heard this clearly, because the archive is a quiet place and voices carry down the stone steps, that she had only done what the documents required. She said it simply, without apology or performance, the way she said everything. He stayed for 20 minutes. He did not touch the files. He looked at the way she had ordered the room, and at one point he asked a question about the cataloging system she had chosen, and she explained it to him in the same patient and precise voice she used for everything. When he left, he thanked her again. He came back on Friday. And the Friday after that. Edith did not see this herself. She heard it the way she heard all things at Vrath Hall, at a slight remove, filtered through the reliable human fact that people who work in a house together notice more than they say, and say more than they intend. What she heard was this: the most feared man on the northern coast had taken to spending his Friday afternoons in the archive, at the long sorting table, reading old correspondence his father had kept. Sometimes Nora Keel was working nearby. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they did not. In the spring, when Nora Keel's temporary engagement was drawn to its natural close, the house manager came to her with a letter from Callum Vrath himself. The position of estate archivist, it said, was being established as a permanent appointment, effective immediately, should she wish to take it. Edith heard, from the house manager's assistant, who had been present when the letter was delivered, that Nora had read it twice, folded it carefully along its existing crease, and said she would be glad to. It was not a proposal. It was not a declaration. It was a door opened carefully, by a man who had kept it shut for 20 years, to a woman who had never once knocked at it but had simply done her work with honesty and care until the door had no good reason left to stay closed. Edith Cran, who had sewn in the upper workroom at Vrath Hall for 34 years and feared the men who owned it for most of them, thought about what it meant to carry a sealed letter up a flight of stone steps rather than set it aside. She thought about the kind of nerve that took, quiet and unspectacular as it was. She thought about her mother's name in the codicil. She bent her head over her work. She did not cry, exactly. But she took more time than usual to thread her needle, and she was grateful the workroom was empty. Some things are hidden for 20 years because someone put them there deliberately. And some people carry them into the light because they simply cannot do otherwise. That, Edith thought, was the whole of it. That, and a man who finally learned to say a woman's name.